The morning after Karen's failed eviction stunt, the neighborhood was alive with gossip. And for once, it wasn't about someone's grass being an inch too high or trash cans left by the curb. It was about Karen getting humiliated on my doorstep. I didn't even have to tell the story myself. The neighbors did it for me. By noon, everyone seemed to know that she had tried to illegally evict me at 6 in the morning, waving fake paperwork like a madwoman, only to be put in her place when I revealed my attorney general credentials. I'd intended to keep my role quiet, blending in like any other resident. But now the truth was out, and it had spread like wildfire. Some neighbors, the ones who had suffered under Karen's absurd rules and constant fines, approached me with cautious smiles. "Did you really flash your badge at her?" one asked, almost in awe. Another said, "If anyone could finally deal with her, it's you." It was clear they saw me as a kind of hope. Someone who could finally stand up to Karen after years of unchecked abuse. I told them I wasn't here to play neighborhood savior, but inside I knew I couldn't ignore what was happening anymore. Karen hadn't just overstepped. She had revealed a dangerous level of arrogance. She believed her HOA title gave her power greater than the law itself, and that kind of unchecked entitlement needed to be addressed. I sat down at my desk later that afternoon and began reviewing the HOA's bylaws, which I had requested a copy of when I first moved in. What I found was both laughable and infuriating. The bylaws were filled with vague language, overreaching clauses, and penalties that were clearly designed to be more about revenue than maintaining a community standard. Worse, there were sections that flat out contradicted state housing laws. It was a goldmine of violations waiting to be exposed. Karen had obviously been weaponizing these bylaws for years, banking on the fact that most homeowners didn't know their rights and couldn't afford to fight back. But I wasn't most homeowners. The more I read, the more it became clear that Karen's little HOA kingdom was built on intimidation, not legitimacy. Still, I didn't want to act rashly. I needed to know just how deep her corruption went, so I started talking to neighbors one by one. At first, they were hesitant, fearing Karen's retaliation, but once they realized who I was, the stories poured out. One neighbor told me Karen had fined them $500 for leaving a child's bicycle on the front lawn for more than an hour. Another shared how she had forced them to remove a small vegetable garden because it clashed with community aesthetics. A single mother revealed through tears that Karen had threatened to place a lien on her home when she fell behind on dues after losing her job. Each story painted a picture of an HOA, not run for the benefit of the community, but as Karen's personal fiefdom. It was worse than I thought. That night, I sat with all these stories running through my mind, and I made a decision. I wasn't going to let this slide. Karen had chosen the wrong person to bully, and she was about to find out what happens when her brand of petty tyranny meets someone with both the knowledge and authority to dismantle it. I began preparing a case. First, I contacted the state's Department of Consumer Protection to open a formal investigation into the HOA's practices. I compiled every neighbor's testimony, the copies of fines they shared with me, and the HOA bylaws themselves. It was enough to make anyone with legal training cringe. But I didn't stop there. I also started digging into the HOA's financial records, which by state law had to be made available to members upon request. Karen tried to stonewall me when I asked for them, claiming they were confidential. That was her second mistake. I reminded her in writing that refusing a member access to financial records was a violation of state statute, and if she didn't comply, she could face legal penalties. A week later, I received the records, and they were damning. There were thousands of dollars unaccounted for, bizarre administrative fees that seemed to line Karen's pockets, and payments made to companies that didn't exist beyond a P.O. box. Fraud, embezzlement, abuse of power, the kind of things that could land her in serious trouble. I smiled grimly as I filed everything away in my folder, the same leather folder I had grabbed the morning she tried to evict me. This time, though, I wasn't just defending myself. I was building a case to protect every family in that neighborhood. Karen, meanwhile, seemed oblivious to the storm that was forming around her. She strutted through the community as if nothing had changed, barking orders, writing citations, and pretending that my reveal hadn't rattled her to the core. She even had the audacity to post a community notice warning residents not to engage in gossip or spread misinformation about the HOA leadership, thinly veiled. Code for, don't talk about my humiliation. But the tide had turned. People were emboldened now. They stopped bowing to her, stopped rushing to comply with every absurd demand. Some even laughed when she issued fines, knowing she was losing her grip. I watched it all quietly, letting her dig herself deeper. Because soon it wouldn't just be the neighborhood whispering about hurt, would be the state. And once the Attorney General's office got involved officially, Karen's little kingdom would crumble to dust. You won't believe the insanity I woke up to one morning when my entitled HOA president, who we'll just call Karen, banged on my front door at 6 in the morning, claiming she had the authority to evict me from my own house. And the way it backfired when I revealed who I really was will leave your jaw on the floor. So stick with me until the end, because this is one of those stories where power and arrogance get crushed in the most satisfying way possible. And if you love seeing HOAs and Karens taken down a peg, make sure to subscribe to Sham Stories so you never miss another tale of justice. It all started when I moved into a quiet suburban neighborhood. Thinking I had found the perfect home to settle into after years of working long hours in public service. The place was peaceful, the lawns were neat, and the people seemed friendly, at least at first. Of course, there was Karen, the HOA president, who walked around the neighborhood with a clipboard like a sheriff, barking orders and handing out fines for the smallest things, a mailbox that wasn't painted the right shade of beige, a garbage bin left at the curb 5 minutes past collection, even kids' chalk drawings on the sidewalk. I knew she was strict, but I figured I could stay off her radar by keeping everything tidy. I was wrong. The first few weeks were quiet until Karen began showing up at my door with complaints that grew more absurd by the day. She didn't like the color of my curtains, claimed the wind chimes on my porch violated noise ordinances, and once fined me for lawn moisture mismanagement because my sprinklers ran 2 minutes too long. I shrugged most of it off, paying little attention because honestly, I had bigger things to worry about. What Karen didn't know and what would come back to bite her was that I wasn't just another homeowner. I was the newly appointed Attorney General for the state, something I kept private to avoid awkwardness with neighbors. That little fact stayed hidden until the morning Karen tried to push me too far. At exactly 6 a.m. on a Saturday, there was a loud, insistent banging on my front door. I stumbled out of bed, threw on a robe, and opened it to find Karen standing there with 2 HOA board members behind her, holding what looked like an eviction notice in her hand. She shoved it toward me without even saying good morning and declared, "You are hereby ordered to vacate this property immediately for repeated violations of HOA bylaws." I blinked at her in disbelief. Vacate. Eviction. At 6 in the morning, she rattled on about how I had ignored her warnings, how my presence lowered property values, and how the HOA had voted to terminate my residency. She said all this with the confidence of someone who truly thought she was above the law. Neighbors peeked from behind curtains, watching like it was a morning show, while I stood there in stunned silence. Then I laughed. "Karen," I said slowly, "you can't evict me. You don't have that kind of authority." But she doubled down, waving the papers in my face and telling me security would arrive to physically remove me if I didn't comply. That was when I decided I had enough. Without another word, I turned, walked back into the house, grabbed my leather folder, and came back to the door. Karen smirked like she thought I was giving in. But the second I pulled out my wallet and flashed my Attorney General identification, the color drained from her face. The board members behind her gasped. I held the badge up clearly and said, "Karen, I enforce the law for this state. What you're doing here is illegal harassment and attempted fraud. Do you want to continue?" The silence that followed was golden. The 2 board members immediately stepped back, muttering excuses about needing to be elsewhere, leaving Karen standing there alone, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. She stammered something about HOA rights and community rules, but the power dynamic had shifted instantly. Neighbors who had gathered to watch began whispering, some even laughing openly. Karen finally spun on her heels and stormed away, but the damage was done. By breakfast time, Entire neighborhood was buzzing with the news that the guy Karen had tried to evict was the attorney general. What Karen didn't realize then was that she had just crossed a line that would lead to a legal reckoning not just for her, but for the entire HOA. The third week after Karen's attempted eviction came with an eerie calm, as though the neighborhood itself was holding its breath, waiting for what would happen next. Karen still patrolled the sidewalks in her oversized sun hat and clipboard, but her usual swagger had dulled. The humiliation of being called out hadn't left her, and the whispers from neighbors followed her everywhere. Yet, she clung to the last shreds of control, doubling down on her petty tactics. Notices appeared on doors, almost daily warnings about unauthorized paint colors, unapproved landscaping, even suspicious gatherings, which apparently included 3 families sharing a barbecue in their driveway. But the difference now was that people weren't afraid anymore. They had started coming to me directly, bringing their notices, asking what was real and what was another one of Karen's invented rules. Every time I reassured them, every time I pointed to the bylaws or state law that proved Karen wrong, they grew stronger, more confident. The fear Karen had fed on for years was fading, replaced with something far more dangerous to her: unity. I wasn't content to simply provide guidance, though. The more I saw, the more determined I became to put an end to her reign. I spent late nights reviewing the HOA's financial records. What I found painted a disturbing picture. Large sums had been siphoned into consulting fees paid to a company registered under Karen's maiden name. Payments had been made to contractors for work that never happened, tens of thousands supposedly spent on community landscaping, improvements when not a single new tree had been planted. Even the HOA's insurance policy had inflated premiums, with Karen's signature authorizing the broker who, conveniently, happened to be her cousin. It was corruption in broad daylight, hidden only by the apathy of residents who were too tired or too scared to fight back. I gathered the evidence carefully, creating timelines, cross-referencing accounts, and compiling witness statements from neighbors. I knew I could have simply dropped it all on Karen's head at once, but part of me wanted her to squirm. I wanted her to feel the weight of inevitability pressing down, the realization that her empire was crumbling around her and there was nothing she could do to stop it. That moment came sooner than I expected. One crisp morning, I received a letter from the HOA board, summoning me to a mandatory compliance hearing for failure to maintain approved occupancy standards. It was Karen's latest stunt, an attempt to scare me into submission. The letter claimed that because I hadn't filed proper notification about moving in, my residence was unauthorized and subject to HOA penalties, including eviction. It was laughable pure nonsense, but it gave me exactly what I needed: proof of her targeting me personally with fabricated charges. When the hearing date arrived, I walked into the community center with my folder under my arm, wearing a calm smile. The board members sat at a folding table, their expressions stiff, while Karen perched in the middle like a queen, presiding over her court. She wasted no time, launching into a tirade about how my disregard for HOA rules undermined the harmony of the community. She waved the letter like it was gospel, her voice dripping with fake authority. I let her rant for a full 5 minutes, watching the board shift uncomfortably as she dug her hole deeper. Finally, I leaned forward, opened my folder, and began laying out documents. First, I said, sliding a copy of the HOA bylaws across the table, there is no clause requiring notification of occupancy for owners in good standing. Second, I added, producing a copy of state housing law. Any attempt to evict or penalize a homeowner for fabricated rules is illegal and constitutes harassment. And third, I said, letting my gaze settle directly on Karen, your misuse of HOA funds, your falsification of records, and your abuse of authority are now under active investigation by the state. The silence that followed was thick enough to choke on. Karen's face went pale, her mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. One of the board members, a timid man who had clearly been under her thumb, finally spoke up. "Is that true?" he asked, looking at Karen nervously. She sputtered, insisting I was making baseless accusations, but I could see the doubt already creeping into their eyes. I didn't need to say more. The seed had been planted, and it was only a matter of time before they turned on her. That night, Karen stormed to my house, pounding on my door like a madwoman. You think you can ruin me? She shrieked. You don't know who you're dealing with. I let her scream until she threatened to call the police and have me dragged out, at which point I opened the door just enough to hold up my badge. Go ahead, I said calmly. Call them. I'd love to explain to them how you've been committing fraud and harassment against your entire community. The look on her face was priceless, a mix of rage, fear, and disbelief. For once, she had no comeback. She stomped off into the night, but I knew this wasn't over. Karen wasn't the type to back down. She was the type to lash out harder when cornered. And cornered she was. In the days that followed, small acts of retaliation began. My mailbox was tampered with. Anonymous complaints about noise and trespassing were filed with the local police, though none held water. Once, I even found nails scattered across my driveway. It was petty, reckless behavior, the actions of someone desperate to reassert control. But with every stunt she pulled, she only dug herself deeper. Neighbors who once cowered under her glare now openly sided with me, offering security camera footage, witness statements, and moral support. Karen's power was slipping through her fingers, and she knew it. The final straw came when I learned she had tried to place a lien on a neighbor's home for overdue dues. The family had actually paid months earlier. She had altered the records to make it seem otherwise, hoping to scare them into paying twice. When they showed me the receipts, I knew Karen had crossed from petty harassment into outright criminal fraud. That was the moment I stopped holding back. I contacted the Department of Consumer Protection directly, forwarding everything I had gathered. I also reached out to the state's real estate commission and the district attorney's office. The wheels of justice began turning quickly now, faster than even I expected. Yet even as I prepared for the inevitable fallout, I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen still had one last card to play. People like her didn't go down quietly. They clung to power with bloody nails. And judging by the furious glares she still shot me every time our paths crossed, I knew she was plotting something big, something reckless. The question wasn't if she would strike again, it was when. The fifth segment began with the HOA board scrambling like rats on a sinking ship, their once united front shattered by Karen's arrest and the flood of complaints from neighbors, who had finally found the courage to speak. For years they had enabled her, turning blind eyes to her abuses because they either benefited from her intimidation or were too afraid to challenge her. But now the shield had cracked. Meetings that once lasted an hour stretched late into the night as residents demanded answers, holding up fines and notices they suspected were fraudulent. Karen's allies on the board looked pale and cornered, stuttering through excuses, while the rest of the neighborhood erupted with anger. I attended one of these meetings, sitting in the back with my binder, not saying a word at first, just watching the collapse unfold. The tension was thick, neighbors shouting over each other, demanding refunds, threatening lawsuits. A man stood up and declared that Karen had fined him $500 for a cracked driveway that wasn't even visible from the street. Another shouted that he had been charged monthly noise violation fees when he lived alone in silence. The board members shuffled papers, trying to maintain order, but no one was listening anymore. Their silence, once mistaken for authority, was now seen for what it was: complicity. And then, as though scripted for maximum drama, Karen herself appeared at the door. She hadn't been in jail for long, only booked and released pending charges, but she looked unhinged. Her hair was a mess, her eyes bloodshot, and she clutched a stack of papers like they were a shield. The room went silent as she staggered forward, shouting, "None of this is legal. You're all being manipulated by him." Her fingers shot toward me, trembling with rage. She waved her papers in the air, claiming they were court documents proving my residency was invalid, that the Attorney General's office was covering up fraud. I stood slowly, my heart pounding but my face calm, and asked her to hand over the documents for review. She refused, clutching them to her chest, screaming that no one could be trusted. The board tried to intervene, telling her she was suspended and had no authority, but Karen ignored them, her voice rising to a fever pitch as she declared herself the only one protecting the neighborhood. People began to murmur, shaking their heads, some filming her breakdown on their phones. It was the final stranding illusion of leadership she had left disintegrated in that moment. Still, as much as her outburst hurt her reputation, it also worried me, because beneath the rambling and the accusations, I could see something darker. Karen wasn't just angry. She was unraveling. That night, my phone buzzed with messages from neighbors warning me that Karen was seen pacing around her house. Screaming into the phone about retaliation and taking back control, some claimed she was calling lawyers. Others swore she had been on the phone with someone shady, arranging something. My gut told me it wasn't just empty threats. People like Karen, when cornered, didn't simply retreat, they lashed out. I increased security again, setting alerts on my cameras, keeping the lights on around the clock. Days later, my caution paid off. My cameras caught her sneaking into my yard at 3 a.m., crouching low with something metallic in her hand. She was trying to tamper with my electrical box. I called the police immediately, and when they arrived, they found her half hidden in the shadows, muttering that she was saving the neighborhood from corruption. This time the officers didn't hesitate. They charged her with trespassing and attempted property damage. Watching her being led away in handcuffs again, I couldn't help but feel a mixture of relief and disbelief. Relief that she had been caught, disbelief that she had sunk so low. But still, I knew even this wasn't the end. Karen wasn't done. The board, meanwhile, was in chaos. With their queen dethroned, factions began to form, some members desperate to distance themselves from Karen. Others scrambling to protect their own skins in case her crimes implicated them. The president pro tem, a nervous man named Greg, called for a special vote to formally remove her, but the process dragged as attorneys were consulted and bylaws dissected. The community's anger grew louder, people threatening to dissolve the HOA altogether. I saw the opportunity in front of me. Karen had created this mess, but I could help dismantle it for good. Using my position and my evidence, I drafted a formal petition to place the HOA under state review, citing fraud, harassment, and mismanagement. The petition circulated rapidly, gaining signatures from nearly every homeowner except Karen's dwindling loyalists. For the first time, the neighborhood wasn't afraid. They were united. Karen, however, wasn't ready to lose. Out on bail again, she stormed through the streets like a ghost of her former self, screaming at anyone who would listen that I was an infiltrator, that the government was in on it, that she alone had the right to rule the neighborhood. Her paranoia had grown into obsession, and though most people ignored her, there were whispers of concern, because obsession breeds recklessness. And sure enough, her recklessness escalated one final time. Late one evening, as I was reviewing documents, I heard the roar of an engine outside. Looking out the window, I saw Karen's car swerving down the street, headlights off, speeding dangerously close to my property. I stepped outside just in time to see her screech to a halt in front of my driveway, jump out, and hurl a brick toward my porch. It missed, shattering against the steps, but the sound echoed through the neighborhood. Lights flicked on, doors opened, and neighbors streamed outside to witness the chaos. Cameras caught every moment her wild hair, her frenzied shouting, her attempt to flee when she realized the police had already been called. The cruiser arrived within minutes, and this time the officers didn't just take her away. They told us flatly, "She's being held. The judge is tired of seeing her walk free." For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. Karen was finally facing real consequences, not just warnings or slaps on the wrist. The neighborhood sighed in collective relief, murmurs spreading that maybe now at last they could have peace. But I knew better than to think it was over. Karen's downfall was imminent. Yes, but the true reckoning, the exposure of her embezzlement, the dismantling of her fraudulent fines, the unraveling of the OS corruption that was still to come, and I would be there to make sure every last piece of her empire crumbled. The fourth segment of this spiraling nightmare began on a foggy Saturday morning when Karen decided to stage her most reckless act yet. She must have realized the walls were closing in, because instead of laying low, she went on the offensive. At 6 a.m., long before the sun had fully risen, she marched down my driveway with two men I didn't recognize, both carrying clipboards and wearing reflective vests like they were some sort of official crew. They began hammering a notice onto my door. One in bright red letters that read "Eviction in Progress." My blood boiled as I read the flimsy sheet of paper. Filled with legal jargon Karen had clearly cobbled together from the internet, with her signature at the bottom, as if she had the authority to enforce it. The two men with her tried to act professional, but they avoided eye contact, and their vests looked like cheap costumes. When I stepped outside, Karen planted herself in front of me, arms crossed, voice booming across the neighborhood as she shouted, "You are being removed from this property immediately for non-compliance." Her tone wasn't just angry, it was desperate, shrill, as though she believed that sheer volume could mask the illegitimacy of her actions. Neighbors, drawn by the commotion, peeked out of their windows, some even stepping onto their lawns to watch. I let her rant for a moment, then pulled out my phone and began recording. The camera shook slightly as I held it, but my voice was calm when I said, "This is an illegal eviction attempt. You have no authority to remove me from my property. And as the Attorney General's office has already been notified of your actions, every word you speak now is evidence." Karen's face twisted into a scowl, and she lunged toward me as if to snatch the phone from my hand. The two men behind her froze, clearly unsure whether they were supposed to intervene or abandon ship altogether. Instead of fighting, I stepped back and reached into my jacket, pulling out my ID once more. The official seal gleaming in the morning light. I held it high enough for the neighbors to see, and suddenly the entire mood shifted. Gasps rippled through the small crowd, whispers spread like wildfire, and the two men in vests immediately backed away, muttering that they wanted nothing to do with this. Karen, however, was too far gone. She doubled down, screaming that I was faking credentials and that she would call the police right now to expose me. I almost laughed at the irony, but instead, I calmly told her to go ahead. Within minutes, sirens pierced the quiet morning, and two patrol cars pulled up. Officers stepped out, hands on their belts, already aware that this wasn't the first time they had been dragged into one of Karen's feuds. Karen, red-faced and panting, rushed over to them, waving her arms and pointing at me like a child tattling to a teacher. "Arrest him," she shrieked. "He's impersonating an official, and he refuses to comply with eviction orders." The officers glanced at me, then at her, then back at me. I walked forward, handed them my actual credentials, and calmly explained the situation. Their expressions hardened as they skimmed the documents, and when they turned back to Karen, their patience was visibly thin. "Ma'am," one officer said sharply, "you cannot attempt to evict anyone without a court order, and certainly not by posting homemade notices." "This is harassment," Karen sputtered, trying to argue, but the officer cut her off. "And if you continue to file false police reports, you may find yourself facing charges. Do you understand?" Her mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air, but no words came out. The officers gave her a final warning, then turned to me with an apology before leaving. The crowd dispersed soon after, many neighbors shaking their heads in disbelief at how far Karen had gone, but the damage to Karen's reputation was irreparable. By noon that same day, social media posts from neighbors had gone viral, locally photos of the fake eviction notice, videos of Karen screaming at me, screenshots of her frantic rants in the HOA's online forum. The once feared HOA president was now the neighborhood punchline. Memes circulated with her face photoshopped onto eviction notices, or her standing in front of moving trucks labeled Karen's Court of Law. I should have felt victorious. But deep down, I knew Karen wasn't finished. People like her didn't back down gracefully. They imploded. Sure enough, the very next evening, my neighbor Sarah knocked on my door, her face pale. She whispered that Karen had been seen shredding boxes of papers in her garage late into the night. Others claimed she had been on the phone with someone, pacing frantically, muttering about covering tracks and making him disappear. I realized then that Karen wasn't just a nuisance anymore. She was a liability. Not just to me, but to the entire community, so I tightened my guard. I installed additional security cameras around my property, checked my locks twice before going to bed, and even alerted my contacts at the Attorney General's office about her escalating behavior. They assured me the investigation was moving quickly. But I couldn't shake the feeling that Karen would try one last desperate stunt before the hammer dropped. And I was right. 2 nights later, around midnight, I woke to the sound of rustling near my garage. Slipping on my shoes, I quietly stepped outside, only to catch Karen herself creeping along my driveway, holding a spray can. She was tagging my garage door with the words, "Illegal resident," in sloppy neon paint. My cameras caught the entire act, and when I flicked on the floodlight, she froze like a deer in headlights. "Karen," I said firmly, "this is vandalism, and you're trespassing. Leave now before I call the police again." But instead of running, she spun around, eyes wild, and screamed, "You don't belong here. None of this belongs to you." Her voice cracked, tears mixing with fury. And for a split second, I saw the truth, not power, not authority, but a broken woman terrified of losing control. Still, sympathy only went so far. I documented the vandalism, called the police, and within 20 minutes, officers were back on the scene. This time, they didn't just warn her. They escorted her to the back of the cruiser as she kicked and screamed, yelling that the neighborhood would regret betraying her. Neighbors, awakened by the flashing lights, gathered in their robes and pajamas, watching silently as the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA was taken away in handcuffs. The once mighty Karen, who had ruled with an iron fist of fines and threats, was now reduced to a spectacle of disgrace. Yet even as the cruiser pulled away, I knew this wasn't the end. People like her never accepted consequences without trying to twist the narrative. Something told me that Karen still had a few tricks left up her sleeve. The following day confirmed my suspicion. A formal letter arrived in my mailbox from the HOA board, not signed by Karen this time, but by 2 other members. It stated that Karen had been temporarily suspended pending investigation, but that concerns remain about your residency compliance. The board was clearly trying to cover themselves, walking a fine line between distancing from Karen and maintaining control, but the tide had already turned. Neighbors who once cowered before Karen now rallied behind me, offering statements, screenshots, and evidence of her harassment. Even the elderly couple she had nearly extorted showed up at my door, holding a stack of documents they were willing to submit as testimony. The power dynamic had shifted completely, and Karen's empire was crumbling faster than she could patch it by the end of that week. I sat in my living room with a folder thick with evidence, hours of video footage, and more neighbor support than I could have hoped for. Karen might have thought she could bully me into leaving, but what she didn't realize was that every stunt, every false report, every desperate attempt to cling to power only tightened the noose around her own neck. The fight wasn't over yet, but one thing was clear. Her downfall was inevitable, and I was going to make sure of it. The 6th segment picked up as the dust began to settle after Karen's violent outburst and arrest. But even with her temporarily behind bars, the scars she left on the community were glaringly obvious. Neighbors who once kept their blinds shut and whispered complaints behind closed doors now spoke openly in the streets, recounting years of fear and intimidation, fines that made no sense, and threats that had left them sleepless. Some were angry at Karen alone, but others aimed their fury at the rest of the HOA board, demanding to know why no one had stopped her sooner, why no one had questioned her authority before it spiraled into madness. Greg, the interim president, looked exhausted and nearly broken. Shuffling from one confrontation to another, trying to hold together a system that was crumbling from the inside out, I watched all of this unfold quietly but deliberately, continuing to gather documents and testimonies, knowing that the state attorney general's office would soon be moving forward with formal charges of fraud and corruption. It wasn't just Karen's collapse that mattered. Now it was the dismantling of the toxic system she had manipulated. My son Mark, still working closely with me on the case, had been instrumental in organizing the testimonies into a cohesive report. With his experience as an FBI agent, he was able to dig deeper into bank accounts and trace funds that revealed a shocking pattern. Tens of thousands of dollars in HOA dues had been siphoned off into accounts connected to Karen and her closest allies. The money trail didn't just expose her. It implicated at least 2 other board members. When I presented the evidence at the next community meeting, there was a collective gasp, followed by a roar of outrage. People who had been fined for lawn height, mailbox paint, or even leaving trash cans out too long, suddenly realized their money hadn't gone toward community improvements. All it had gone straight into Karen's pocket. Greg tried to calm the storm, promising that he hadn't known, that he was willing to cooperate with authorities, but the crowd was unforgiving. The residents wanted accountability, and they wanted it now. That night, they voted overwhelmingly to suspend the entire board pending investigation. For the first time in decades, the HOA was essentially leaderless, and instead of chaos, it felt like freedom. Karen, however, didn't fade quietly into the background. Even from custody, she found ways to send out venom. Handwritten letters began showing up in mailboxes around the neighborhood. Rambling manifestos declaring her innocence and accusing me of orchestrating a witch hunt. Some of the letters were incoherent, with words scrawled in capital letters. Arrows pointing at nonsensical phrases like false authority and undercover sabotage. But others contained veiled threats, references to neighbors' children. Mentions of cars parked in specific driveways late at night. Chilling reminders that she knew far too much about people's private lives. Parents grew nervous, people double-checked their locks, and once again the community was on edge. I took the letters directly to the police and ensured they were added to her growing list of charges. But the psychological toll lingered. It was clear Karen wasn't just a bully. She was dangerous. Determined to give my neighbors a sense of hope, I invited them to my home for a gathering. What started as a small meeting quickly turned into a full-blown town hall, with more than 30 families filling my backyard. We sat beneath string lights, sipping coffee and sharing stories, not just of Karen's harassment, but of what we wanted our community to become without her shadow looming over it. Some dreamed of dissolving the HOA entirely, tearing out its roots so it could never grow back. Others suggested restructuring it into something truly democratic, with checks and balances that made abuse of power impossible. I listened carefully, taking notes, encouraging people to voice their opinions. For the first time, instead of fear, there was laughter. Genuine laughter as neighbors realized they were finally free to speak without the threat of fines or retaliation. Children played in the yard without parents, anxiously glancing over their shoulders. It was a glimpse of what life could be like without Karen, and it strengthened our resolve. But Karen wasn't ready to let go. Somehow, she managed to secure bail again, and within a week, she was back in the neighborhood. Her presence was like a dark cloud drifting back in, unsettling everyone. She wasn't allowed to attend HOA meetings anymore. But that didn't stop her from pacing up and down the sidewalks, glaring into people's homes, muttering under her breath. She parked her car at the end of the street with binoculars, watching houses like she was on a stakeout. The police received calls almost daily. But without catching her actively breaking the law, they were limited in what they could do. It became a game of cat and mouse pushing boundaries, daring us to react, and us trying to hold steady until her court date arrived. My son warned me that cornered individuals like her often escalated, and sure enough, he was right. One night, just after midnight, my motion sensors alerted me. Checking the cameras, I saw Karen creeping along the side of my house with a can of spray paint. I didn't confront her this time. I let the cameras record her scrawling vile words across my garage door. Phrases like traitor and liar. Once she was finished, she turned toward the camera, pointed directly at it, and mouthed the words, "I'm coming for you." The footage was chilling, but it was also the evidence we needed. The police arrived quickly, arrested her on the spot, and this time, the judge had had enough. Her bail was denied, and she was held until trial. The neighborhood erupted in applause when they heard the news, some even setting off small fireworks in celebration. Still, as much as it felt like a victory, I knew we had to prepare for the trial itself. Karen's downfall wasn't complete until the court stripped her of every ounce of the power she had abused. As the trial loomed closer, media outlets began to pick up the story. What started as a local headline, "HOA leader arrested for fraud and harassment," soon spread to regional stations. Then national news. Reporters camped outside the neighborhood, cameras rolling as they interviewed residents about years of abuse. Some neighbors were nervous about the attention, but most were relieved. The more public Karen's story became, the less chance she had of escaping accountability. I gave a statement myself, not in anger, but in calm resolve, explaining how communities could thrive when freed from corruption. The news crews ate it up, framing the narrative as a classic tale of power abused and justice served. Karen, of course, hated it. From behind bars, she reportedly raged about media conspiracies, insisting that she was the victim of a smear campaign. But her words carried less and less weight as the world watched her unravel. The trial began with dramatic flair, Karen's defense attorneys painting her as a misunderstood leader who had been unfairly targeted by vindictive neighbors. But the mountain of evidence was impossible to deny: bank records, video footage, written threats, and dozens of testimonies, all pointing to a pattern of abuse. My son testified first, laying out the financial crimes with surgical precision, showing how money flowed from HOA accounts into Karen's personal accounts through a web of shell transactions. Then I testified, recounting the harassment, the false eviction attempt, fines, the intimidation tactics, and finally the acts of vandalism and trespassing. Neighbors followed, one after another, their voices steady, their courage shining through years of fear. The jury listened intently, their expressions hardening as the picture became clear. Karen wasn't a misunderstood leader, she was a predator who had exploited her neighbors for her own gain. By the end of the second week, it was obvious where the verdict was headed. The defense tried to argue that Karen was mentally unwell, deserving of sympathy rather than punishment, but even that rang hollow. Sympathy required remorse, and Karen showed none. She sat in the courtroom with her arms crossed, glaring daggers at anyone who spoke against her, shaking her head violently, muttering under her breath. When the prosecution rested, there was an air of finality in the room, as if the weight of years of injustice had finally been brought into the light. And as the jury deliberated, the neighborhood waited with bated breath, knowing that everything we had endured, the fear, the chaos, the retaliation, was about to be validated. The seventh and final stretch of this saga began with the jury's deliberations, and though the room was hushed, the air carried a tension so thick you could practically hear every nervous heartbeat echoing through it. Neighbors filled the gallery, sitting shoulder to shoulder, their eyes locked on the jury box as if waiting for their own lives to be validated. I sat beside my son, who had his arm draped protectively across the back of my chair. And though he was calm on the surface, I could sense the quiet storm brewing within him too. Karen sat across the room, her once meticulously maintained appearance disheveled from weeks behind bars. Her blonde hair hung limp, her blazer wrinkled, her face pinched into an expression of equal parts rage and defiance. When the bailiff announced that the jury had reached a verdict, the entire courtroom stiffened like one body holding a collective breath. The foreman stood, unfolded a slip of paper, and delivered the words we had all prayed for: guilty on all counts: fraud, harassment, intimidation, vandalism, trespassing, and misuse of HOA funds. The sound that followed was not a cheer, but a low, trembling sigh of relief, as though the entire community had been holding its breath for years and was finally allowed to exhale. Karen's face twisted, and for the first time since this nightmare began, I saw something break behind her eyes. Not remorse, but a dawning realization that her reign of terror was truly over. The judge wasted no time handing down a sentence. Given the severity of her crimes and the years of damage inflicted, Karen was sentenced to a lengthy prison term with no possibility of early release. And the courtroom erupted in whispers of astonishment. It wasn't common for HOA corruption to land someone in prison, but Karen wasn't common. She was extreme, and her punishment reflected it. When she was led away in cuffs, she twisted back toward us, her lips curling into a final snarl, as if promising vengeance even from behind bars. But this time, no one flinched. No one turned away in fear. We all just watched her vanish behind the heavy courtroom doors. It was like watching the final shadow disappear from our lives. Neighbors hugged each other, some even wept. And I felt my son squeeze my shoulder with a quiet whisper. "It's over, Mom." But even as he said it, I knew that what came next would be just as important as the trial itself: the rebuilding, the reclaiming of our community, and the lessons we had learned from the storm we'd endured. Back in the neighborhood, the atmosphere was different almost overnight. For the first time in as long as anyone could remember, there were no threatening letters taped to doors, no fines slipped into mailboxes, no Karen patrolling the sidewalks like a self-appointed tyrant. The silence was strange at first, almost eerie, but it quickly transformed into something warm and healing. People planted flowers without worrying about their color. Families painted their shutters whatever shade they liked. Neighbors who had avoided each other out of fear of being reported for petty violations now stopped to chat by their driveways, sharing smiles instead of suspicion. The HOA officially dismantled after the board was disbanded, was replaced with a simple neighborhood committee run democratically, where no one person had unchecked power. It was a new era, and though we still bore the scars of Karen's reign, carried them with pride as reminders of what we'd survived and what we'd never allow again. In the weeks that followed, life slowly settled back into a rhythm. Though it wasn't the same rhythm as before, it was freer, lighter. My mailbox, once a source of dread, now held nothing but bills and cheerful flyers from local businesses. My garage, once defaced with slurs by Karen herself, had been repainted by neighbors who showed up one Saturday with brushes and paint cans, insisting on helping me restore it. It wasn't just about fixing vandalism, it was about reclaiming what had been stolen from us. On weekends, children played soccer in the cul-de-sacs, their laughter echoing where Karen's scolding used to ring out. And one evening, as the sun set over the rooftops, the entire neighborhood gathered for a block party, the first in years. There was food, music, dancing, and an overwhelming sense of community. Standing among them, I felt tears sting my eyes, not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. We had fought a battle and won, not just against Karen, but against the fear she had instilled in us. Karen's name still came up in conversations, of course, often as a warning or a dark joke. Don't go full Karen. People would laugh when someone got too strict. Out the rules during a game, or when a neighbor teased another about trimming hedges. But more than anything, her story became a cautionary tale. A reminder of what happens when power goes unchecked and why communities must stand together to protect themselves. My son often said she was the perfect example of entitlement turned dangerous, and he wasn't wrong. Yet as much as she had hurt us, she had also united us in ways we hadn't thought possible. Ironically, by trying to control everything, Karen had forced us to discover the strength we had together. And for that strange twist of fate, I couldn't help but be grateful. Months later, as the news cycle moved on and Karen settled into obscurity behind prison walls, I was invited to speak at a state conference on HOA reform. Standing on stage, I recounted our story, the 6 a.m. attempted eviction, the police calls, the intimidation, and finally the trial. The audience was captivated, gasping and laughing at the absurdities, nodding with empathy at the struggles. But when I revealed who I was, flashing the same Attorney General ID that had first stunned Karen into silence, the room erupted into applause. It wasn't just about the badge, it was about the reminder that no one, not even the most entitled HOA Karen, is above the law. People approached me afterward to share their own horror stories, asking for advice on how to push back, how to organize, how to stand up against injustice. It was humbling to realize that our little neighborhood drama had become a source of inspiration far beyond our streets. As for me and my son, our lives went back to a new version of normal. He continued his work in the FBI, though he admitted this case had been one of the most personal of his career. I continued working in the Attorney General's office. Though every time I walked into a courtroom now, I carried with me the reminder of how fragile communities could be and how resilient they could become when united. Sometimes I caught myself glancing at my front porch early in the morning, half expecting Karen to appear with a clipboard in hand, barking about imaginary violations. But the sight never came, and instead, I was greeted by the quiet peace of my own home, safe at last. Still, one night as I closed my curtains, I thought about Karen sitting in her cell. Did she still stew in anger, blaming us for her downfall? Or did she ever reflect on her choices and realize she had destroyed herself? I doubted the latter, but it no longer mattered. Her power was gone, and ours had been restored. We had proven that no bully, no matter how relentless, could withstand the truth and the law combined. Our story was not just about an HOA gone wrong, it was about justice, community, and the courage to stand up when it matters most. And as I turned off the light, I smiled to myself, knowing the chapter was closed for good. This story might have started with a 6 a.m. knock on my door and a power-hungry HOA Karen who thought she could control every inch of my life, but it ended with her downfall, justice served, and a neighborhood reborn stronger than ever. And if you think this tale of entitlement, defiance, and ultimate victory over abuse of power was wild, just wait until you hear what happens in the next story, because trust me, HOA Karens never learn, and their arrogance always sets the stage for their downfall. Don't miss what comes next, and if you want to hear more unbelievable HOA stories like this one, make sure you subscribe right now to the Sham Stories YouTube channel, because you won't want to miss the chaos, the drama, and the sweet, sweet justice that follows.